Hi, I'm Ed Amoroso from Tag Cyber, and I'm here with my longtime friend, George Avetisov, who is the CEO and co-founder of a New York City-based company called HYPR. How you doing, George?
Good morning, Ed. How's it going?
Oh, doing great. It's good to see you. I know you and I have talked frequently over the years. It's going to be fun to catch up and see some of the things that I know you and the team have been working on the last year or so. You guys have been busy. So,
We've been very busy. Yeah, surprisingly busy with everything that's going on.
well, you work in a good area. Why don't you start with just like the elevator summary of the company, and then we can start talking about technology a little bit. But share what it is that you guys do.
Sure. So look, at HYPR, we're eliminating passwords. We believe that passwords are finally, they've been obsolete for a while, but we can finally get rid of them. Our customers are small, medium, and large businesses across the globe. Folks like MasterCard and Rakuten and CVS Health. These are companies that have big password problems. These problems are for their consumers who deal with password reuse and account takeover, and also their employees who deal with phishing attacks and credential stuffing and credential reuse attacks. And their vision is to eliminate the use of passwords. They want to replace passwords with the use of the smartphone. They want to replace passwords with the use of security tokens and FIDO tokens. And really, HYPR is the passwordless company that's making that possible for them. So we've had the privilege of deploying passwordless authentication to millions of users. We've raised almost $40 million to date in venture capital, and we're continuing to grow. It's been an awesome year.
I've heard you joke about that when you and I and others say passwordless, that sometimes people mistake that for something else. I think you ran a study recently. What did you find in that?
Yeah, we publish, so we do these user studies very often, and more recently we wanted to better understand how the older population perceives authentication and login preferences and how they feel about passwords. And one interesting thing that stood out was how many people thought that passwordless meant no login at all, meaning you could just walk into an account with a username, you're not even prompted to authenticate. So I thought that was funny because that's not something you hear often.
Well, I take that older thing very personally, so I'm going to have to, but it is true. I think when you say passwordless, that's a concept that I think it's changing now. I think it's gaining real traction because people have gotten to see what this is about. Now, question: Do you see the primary value here for people working on the back end doing all the password resets? I mean, a lot of that goes away. Or is it more for the end user where it just be a less friction in logging in? Where's the primary value, or is it both? It may be both.
All right, so one of the things that people have a hard time understanding is where's the passwordless going to make the impact most immediately? I think it's in a couple of places. As you mentioned, the back-end folks who deal with the password resets, that's a big one. We have a customer who once a year, when everybody would log in to use the platform to renew their policy or whatever, they would have a big password Armageddon, they called it, because people would forget their passwords all at the same time, and they'd call customer service, and this would just it would be an awful experience for the end user. It'd be an awful experience for the service folks, and it costs a lot of money. So by going passwordless, you're essentially eliminating that password reset phone call at a pretty big scale. Now, I forgot my password gets replaced with I lost my smartphone, or I lost my laptop, or I lost my token. But that happens a lot less often than forgetting your password. So that's a big factor in addition to the user experience. The user experience, I think, is number one. As much as we in the security industry like to talk up how you're going to be more secure, how you're going to save money, the TCO, these are the bullet points you see on every website. We tend to neglect the user experience aspect of it, and I think that's what passwordless really has going for it. For example, when we have customers who put HYPR in a bake-off against certain other authentication methods, when people use this true passwordless login to their workstation or their web portals or their single sign-on, they never want to go back to what they had before. And they very rarely want to use password plus MFA or some of these legacy methods. So I think the user experience is key. It's number one, and it is the deciding factor between will passwordless be successful at scale.
HYPR is obviously part of a bigger industry shift in this direction, no question about it. So maybe you could take us through a few of the things you've seen. I know you guys have done some research, and you and I have also written some things, like Microsoft, for example, with Windows Hello and other things. Take us through some of the thinking there, because I think it's more than just the HYPR platform. This really feels like a gigantic seismic shift in the way the whole industry kind of deals with authentication. Maybe you can share your thoughts there.
So we call it the passwordless movement. We think this is an industry-wide movement. We think that everybody's going to be impacted by this because, Ed, when you look at cyber, it's hard to say what the transformational moment has been in this industry. Because when you look at IT, you've got the cloud transformed everything, changed everything for everyone forever. When you look at the consumer space, you've got the rise of the mobile device that changed the way people shop and experience digital life forever. We can't really point to a moment like that in InfoSec. It's more of a reactionary industry. Stuff happens, we fix it, things break, we make them better. But we believe that passwordless is that transformational moment, that point where when we look back 30 years from now, we're going to say, how are things different before passwordless and after? Because so much of the industry is built on top of this premise of stolen credentials. Much of these products, many of these products that we see, many of these whole companies are built on the premise of stolen and reused and attacked credentials. And I think once passwordless reaches a critical mass, and it already is there. I mean, we've got Microsoft saying 150 million people use passwordless just on their platforms every month. That's a lot. That's not taking into consideration Touch ID, MacBooks, Face ID, all these other folks who are using passwordless day in and day out. I mean, HYPR alone has more than 50 million passwordless users deployed. So to that point, I think what's going to happen, Ed, is passwordless will be remembered as the transformational moment where the attack landscape shifted, the industry landscape shifted, the vendor landscape shifted, and we're going to remember it for many years to come.
Now, you mentioned FIDO earlier. I want to ask if you can just say a few words about that, because industry alliances, often get you from point A to point B. But what do you think's been the role of the FIDO alliance? I know you've looked very favorably on a number of things that they've done. How has that sort of built sort of a base, and how have you guys taken it to the next level?
So FIDO, or Fast Identity Online, is an open standard for better authentication. And the FIDO Alliance is one of those few industry consortiums that's actually gotten its mission done. And there's still a long way to go, but typically when you think of an industry alliance, you think meetings and phone calls and boards and sponsorships, but you don't think that they're going to actually successfully complete their mission. And the FIDO Alliance has done just that, right? On the board are some amazing companies, folks like Microsoft and MasterCard and Google, and HYPR is a board member. There are too many to name. I mean, it's a fantastic group.
A lot of power there.
A lot of innovation too. There's a lot of influential companies who contribute to the standard and want to see passwordless take shape. I think we all get along very well. I think we all contribute very well. And if there was no FIDO standard, I don't think that passwordless authentication would be getting the traction it is today. Because before you want a movement to happen, you got to get people to agree on how it should work at a conceptual level. And I think FIDO has done just that.
Now, a lot of people, when they think, at least when I'm talking to enterprise teams, I say passwordless, immediately they jump to mobile. And I think there's some basis for that, right? I mean, you mentioned a little while ago. You think mobile is really is that one of the really important keys? Like, has that been an enabling factor, this idea that everybody's got a mobile and you can always do some sort of mobile push? What are your thoughts on the role of mobile in passwordless?
We genuinely believe that no mobile, no passwordless. I mean, if you didn't have this ingredient, it wouldn't be happening. Because when you look at the ways we can do passwordless, I'm super proud of like what Windows Hello is doing on the desktops, and I love security tokens like the YubiKey. These are fantastic solutions, and they've gone a long way in getting people to use passwordless day in and out. But this is the thing that people are obsessed with. They love it. We have a saying here at HYPR. It's everyone is a millennial. And the reason we say that is because it doesn't matter what your age group or demographic is, you are glued to this thing. And people want to use this thing for more and more and more. So when we talk with folks who say, we piloted HYPR and we piloted it alongside some other login methods, and people really liked using their phone to log in. That was surprising. And we're like, are you really surprised? I mean, every time you ask them to put the phone down, they get upset at you. So I think, to your point, the smartphone is the way passwordless scales. It's not the only way, but it's certainly the way that HYPR has been focused on, and it is being very successful.
I mean, is the smart card going to just eventually go away, you think?
Well, this is your smart card.
Fair.
We tell people the smartphone is the new smart card. Smart cards were
Fair point.
very successful, but they're a piece of hardware, right? And sometimes we call this your FIDO token, right? However you want to position it, this is the new authenticator.
Now let's talk about your platform. If somebody wants to move from a traditional password-oriented authentication scheme, what's the journey? Is this something you do? Does it take a year? Does it take 6 months? Is it less than that? What's been your experience with companies? Because probably a lot of people watching right now saying, "Wow, I think I might like to do that for my e-commerce site or my whatever they're doing." Well, what's your advice there? Like, what should they expect to make that transition?
There's two primary use cases. You and I have dug deep into these. We've interviewed folks. We've looked at the top 10 passwordless use cases, but really they bucket into consumer-facing applications and enterprise workforce access, right? So on the consumer-facing side, integrating HYPR's SDK or any passwordless SDK for that matter is the process of getting it plugged into your mobile and web applications, getting it integrated with your identity providers, and deploying it to your users. And I think what happens there and what we've seen with customers is the actual deployment process is very straightforward. It's very quick. We call it almost a developer-free model, right? Because you want to be able to plug and play passwordless and give it to your users. The ramp-up period is getting people to update their apps, right? Some folks have auto update, others, tend to wait as long as they want to or as long as they can. And just to give you some figures, we had a customer who deployed HYPR. Total user rollout was 4 million. They had close to 1 million users in the first quarter. So app update cycles are very important, and you're kind of at the mercy of that on the consumer side. So that is very different and a stark contrast from workforce applications. On the workforce side, you're kind of forcing people to use what you tell them to use, right? And MFA is nothing new in the enterprise, but passwordless MFA is a different experience. Password plus MFA takes the employees anywhere from 10 to 20, 30 seconds to log in sometimes. Passwordless MFA should take under 5 seconds. So there's a little bit of a user behavior improvement there that people quickly learn, and they realize that this is my new way to log in. So in terms of rollout, the actual implementation of HYPR, deploying the mobile app, getting it onto folks' machines, having them use it with their cloud applications or single sign-on, that's very straightforward. I think the communications part is important. You have to tell people what's coming and why they're using what they're using. People will adopt it if they love it, but they need to know why they're using it.
Yeah. And you have to update a lot of paperwork. Like there's probably some user guides and compliance stuff and other things that just needs the update. That's a happy thing to do because you're making things simpler. But that's been my experience when I talk to people. They say, I probably have to go attend to some things, loose ends like training and so on.
Have you seen enterprises over the last few years become more open to using the the partners or the vendors' material to educate?
To educate their employees?
Yes.
I do. And I have sort of mixed feelings about that. I think it's important to work with your vendor to make sure. For example, I know you guys would help a client, let's say they have compliance documentation that just needs update from password to passwordless. I'm all for working with the experts to do that. always a little tenuous about maybe listing the vendor's name in there. Like a lot of times I see somebody will say, you know, our policy is to run a Qualis scan every week. And I go, well, that's great. If you're Philippe, he's probably very happy to see that his name is in your policy. But if you change to Tenable, then you got to go change the documentation. So I usually say work with the vendor. They'll give you great language. I know you guys help your enterprise customers, but when you code a customer or a vendor name in, as much as they'd like to be there, it's probably not the greatest idea to do that. You probably see some of that as well.
Yeah, it's funny. So I think early on we had some folks who were like, yeah, we want people to know we're using Hyper. We want them to think we're an innovative, young company that's hip. And we said, okay, great. Let's put Hyper, plaster it all over these guys, right? And then you get to some of the more, the larger conservative or international organizations, and they want things to be a little bit more white label, right? So I think what we have is a good balance of user guides and communications templates for our customers that focus on the word passwordless, right? If you get the enterprise to start using this vocabulary, like passwordless mobile login, Hyper app, they can swap that name out anytime. And the fewer instances of it that they see, the easier it is for their communications team. So it's actually pretty easy way to get there. Now, where you really got to be careful is with branding. Some of these companies actually want, you give them a doc and they want to swap out your logos and your colors, and they break your fonts and everything, and the end result looks like a mess. So I think if you make things a little bit more static and don't give them everything to edit, I think that'll make their life and your life a lot easier.
A little style guide would be good. Here is one thing that we do see that I'd love to hear what you think. When you first describe this sort of thing to executives, because a lot of times, our team, when we're talking to decision makers, we always include this as one of the recommendations that you ought to move to passwordless. It's funny how the executives often view the transition as maybe becoming less secure, whereas at the working level, they recognize that you're actually making it more secure. I'm curious what you think, because when passwordless may be not even the best branding choice, because it almost implies that you're becoming less secure, but the irony is it is exactly the opposite. Do you see that sometimes when you're talking, particularly like the senior managers, they get confused?
Passwordless MFA. You got to combine them. You have to
Yeah,
say passwordless MFA as often as possible.
that's a fair point.
Because if they're uncertain or new to the passwordless part, they're most certainly not new to the MFA part. And
Yeah.
I think when you introduce this thing to people, so the first and foremost way you want to get an executive on board is you just show it to them, right? You can talk all day about this and that, and your logs and how fast it is and how much better it is. I read a post you did recently where skip the logo slides in the sales deck and get to the demo, right? It's just
Right.
just get to the thing. What is it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that when the executives see it, they go, wow, okay, that's fast. It's almost too fast. In fact, our CTO has a saying, this demo is going to take 30 seconds, but it'll take me 30 minutes to explain what happened. Right? So that's where the practitioners really understand what's going on, what's the underlying architecture. They're familiar with PKI, they're familiar with FIDO often, they're familiar with smart cards, as you mentioned, and they know what's happening. But you got to use that vocabulary so that the executives, the people paying for it, can easily understand and comprehend that it's much more secure than what they have today.
Awesome. Well, we're at prediction time. I want to hear what you think is coming down the road. I've met your team. You got a lot of smart people, and I know a lot of them are working on kind of forging the future here. What are you kind of expecting and maybe even betting on happening in the next few years?
I agree with you. A lot of people here smarter than me. That's for sure. They're incredible. They work around the clock. They love this mission. They love what we're doing here. I think everyone here sees different slices of the same future, right? It's a passwordless future. It's one where 20, 30 years from now, some of the folks here, they'll be helping their kids study in history class, and how we were reading about the telegraph, they'll be asking their parents, what's a password, they can tell them the story of how they eliminated the password. Now, as far as short to medium term, I think we're living in the passwordless decade. I think over the next 3 to 5 years, depending on who you ask, passwords will be the lesser used authenticator. It will fall back to a secondary, not a primary. It'll happen very quickly. I think if you look at a recent study we did on millennials, real millennials, Gen Z and millennial users, their perception of password managers is remarkable. Some of them don't even know what a password manager is. You know, these people are being raised on Touch ID and Face ID, and they don't even know why they would need a password manager because they're starting to have fewer passwords from day one. So I think we're living in the passwords decade. We're going to make it out of the 2020s. If we make it out of the 2020s, we will probably be leaving behind passwords. I'm an optimist. I am very optimistic about the future. So I do think that'll happen. But one controversial prediction I think, Ed, that we have is that this problem will not be solved by the big, giant, conglomerates and the big tech. It's too specific a problem, and their platforms have become too large to actually solve it. I'm happy to elaborate on that if you want to hear more.
I mean, Google and Facebook, I think, would be okay with the message. Do you think that there's a piece of this that they're not in the right? And I assume you're referring Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Twitter, and so on. These companies, they're not in the best position to lead the way here?
And also the big identity companies, like I think there are some phenomenal identity leaders out there who.
Well, Microsoft is a giant influencer, obviously, in identity, right? They're there everywhere.
Great example, great company, great products. The mission around passwordless has been clear. They've been pushing it for a while. I think what's happened is there's been this passwordless marketing surge over the past couple of years, right? Where customers and prospects will come to us and they'll say, hey, I was promised this passwordless thing, and then when I got it wasn't really passwordless. It just seemed that way, or we still remember a password, or there's still a password in AD, we just generally don't use it. Like, what is that to you? And we've started to tell people that, look, there's a difference between passwordless marketing and passwordless MFA. Okay, you start to see that line very clearly these days, and I think the customers they're not falling for it anymore as much as they used to. And the reason I say this is because the big platforms saw passwordless as a feature. They saw it as something that they could implement as part of their product suite, as part of their login flows. But it is too important and too specific to be treated as a feature. We treat it as a mission as a company, and that's why we're able to do it. We have people working around the clock on the edge cases, on the speed, the performance, the little nuanced usability things about passwordless. And I think the big companies are so large, and in many cases that they're so dependent on passwords as a whole in their identity stack that it's very difficult for them to move away. And I get a lot of heat for this from them because their marketing teams just they fire the passwordless gun every which way possible, but we genuinely think it will not be a big incumbent to solve this problem.
Yeah. Well, I agree totally. One thing I would warn you though is in the time I've known you, you guys have gotten bigger. Pretty soon you are starting to look like a pretty big concern yourself. You'll be a big company in no time. But,
me personally, I've gotten bigger. I could lose a couple of the quarantine folds.
We've watched your influence, not just you, but your whole team. It's been nice because I know when we first met, I agreed with what you guys believe in. I think that's really important to do something that you know is right. It's always impressed me about your team. So, hey, listen, if people want to learn more, I'm guessing, is a website the best place for them to go? On
HYPR.com. Don't go to the Twitter. Don't go to the LinkedIn. Just go to the website.
That's fair. Well, listen, as always, it's just a delight to meet up. Pretty soon the pandemic will wane. You and I can do these live again. We'll want to catch up again soon because I know you guys have so much going on. But listen, on behalf of everybody watching and my whole team, thanks so much for a nice chunk of time here. I really enjoyed it.
Ed, have a great morning. Keep doing what you're doing, brother.
And you stay safe. We'll
Thank you
see
for
you.
having me.
And for everyone, we'll see you all next time.